Welcome to Public Safety Talk Radio, the podcast for all of our heroes in public safety, including law enforcement professionals, firefighters, EMTs, corrections officers, healthcare workers, and more. This show is produced by the POCUA and is founded upon its Soundness initiative. This episode is also sponsored by the POCUA, a consortium of financial institutions serving law enforcement, as well as other first responders and public safety professionals. Always remember, if you aren't banking with a POCUA credit union, you're just working with an institution that just so happens to serve public safety professionals, and you deserve better. I am Ken Bader, your host for Public Safety Talk Radio, and I have a great show today. We're going to hit a couple of different angles to talk about what's going on in our country today, and a lot is going on, but we're going to talk a bit about some of the law enforcement incidents and the response to it. We're going to have a great discussion because I have a great guest named Robert Thibodeau, who is not only an ordained preacher and founded Evangelism Radio. He's been running that since 1997. I don't even remember what the heck I was doing in 1997. And he's a retired police sergeant. So Robert Thibodeau, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, appreciate it, Ken. Anytime I can help out our fellow law enforcement and first responders, man, I'm all over it.
Yeah, dude, we need your help, man. We need your help. And yeah, just so you know, I've known Robert for a few years now. He's a great podcaster, does a lot of great shows, and is a man of faith. And I think if we ever needed faith, we definitely need it now. Any thoughts on that, Robert, with all the stories that you're hearing out there?
Sometimes when you're watching stuff on the news, faith is all you can have. Faith that, this is not, well, I'll just put it like this, it's not taking God by surprise.
Yeah.
But according to what we see in the Bible about living in the last days, what we're seeing every night on the news is just falling right in line with all of that. I mean, there can be no doubt about it.
Yeah, I was actually speaking with a group of police foundation leaders earlier today, and one of them mentioned, because we talked about what are you doing to support police officers in what is possibly, definitely in my lifetime, but probably in most people's lifetimes, the worst time ever for law enforcement professionals. And one of the people said, you know what, prayer. We're actually getting on Zoom and helping police officers with their faith and praying with them. And because that is a source of peace in this complete chaotic time. I know that it's helped me during this. I'm sure you've come across in all of this chaos, given your faith, that you're finding some peace from it as well.
Yeah, amen. Like I said, that's the whole purpose of your faith, is to see you through those trying times, and knowing that everything, when the world's going to hell around you, there's something that is still above that. And, and I know so many police officers that, have to go down into the trenches and they're facing this stuff on a nightly basis. And they use their faith, for protection, to allow them to do the job they need to do and come back home safe and sound. And it just wasn't, just not the riots and all that that's talked about, but, for law enforcement, it's a nightly thing or a daily thing. Every time you put that uniform on and walk out the door, a traffic stop can go bad so quickly. A routine, you're stopping in at 7-Eleven to get a cup of coffee and it's in the midst of an armed robbery. You walk right in on it. So, I mean, you just, that's part of the job,
Yeah.
And with all that we see going on right now in the current events on the news and the attacks on law enforcement, something that they don't want to talk about in the media, but a lot of these interactions where these people are being shot is because they fail to comply with an order to stand down.
Right.
You don't want to give up. You don't want to put your hands up. Well, I guess we'll just ignore all the violations just did and let you go. That's really what the rioters want, is for the police to become so hands off, that's the policy. Well, it doesn't matter if I robbed somebody or shot somebody. You don't have a right to talk to me, type thing. And that's 99% of the problems that the riders are talking about.
Yeah, it's such an absence of logic. And I don't have the answer for this. Maybe you do, as both a preacher and a retired police officer. But it's just such an absence of logic. And I understand the emotion. Let's take one of the most recent cases, which is the Jacob Blake case in Kenosha. When you just watch the video, especially if you don't watch the entire video, I understand the emotional, visceral reaction of seeing somebody getting grabbed by the back of their shirt and getting shot 7 times. And I would even say, all right, 7, let's talk about that. But, when you see the whole picture, first that he had several chances to comply,
right?
Coupled with the fact that, the way I understand it, there was a knife in the car where he was going, and the officers have a responsibility not only to protect themselves, to protect the kids in that car, to protect everybody else if somebody is going for a weapon. So you see all of those and those aspects to what happened. And then you also learn that this guy isn't an altar boy. He's not, he's not a choir boy. He's got a record against women, which I have a serious problem with. So you have this absence of logic that creates, whether it's basketball players, not playing that day, or people looting and rioting based upon, this incident. Which, okay, maybe he shouldn't have been shot 7 times, but he certainly needed to comply, and the police had to do something. Yeah, how do you combat that lack of logic? Do you just pray, or is there some way you could reach people and say, come on now, let's look at the whole picture?
Yeah, well, talking about the individual instances like that, people react to, oh, they shot him, and he didn't have a gun. He didn't, all that. Well, having been in that situation, I mean, there's one instance that I'm thinking of. To this day, I don't know how my finger stopped the trigger, because I'd already taken the play out of the trigger pull and was in the process of squeezing that round off, because everything had told me this guy has a gun, and he turned his back to flee again as I'm pulling the trigger, because he had turned around to confront me, and I was getting ready to, my flashlight had reflected off something in his hand, and witnesses, as I was in this chase, had told me he has a gun, all right? And he turned around to confront me about 15 feet away, and I'm pulling, I got him right there, And as I'm pulling the trigger, he turned, and now I'm looking right dead center at his back, and I'm thinking in my mind, this is not gonna end good, because I was in the middle of the woods, a white guy chasing a black guy, right? And my figure stopped, and when I released her, reholstered, and I, this guy now had another 10-yard head start on me.
Yeah.
I caught him within like 30 yards because I was so hyped up on adrenaline by that time. And it wasn't a gun. He had a cell phone,
Yeah.
But I know these decisions these officers are making are in like half a second is what they're processing. And they have to process, is there a threat? Am I being threatened by this individual? What is the appropriate reaction? Okay. Now, when the public sees the video, they only see, that 30 seconds or 45 seconds of that part. They do not see, the 2-minute foot chase. They don't see, the interaction and all the resistance going on and the threats made to other people. These are all things that the officer's going through in that 1 second when that decision is being made. It's not an easy decision when you're going to decide to take someone's life. And people say, well, you should have shot the gun out of his hand or the knife out of his hand or shoot him in the leg.
You watch too many movies.
Yeah. And, the officer is facing an imminent threat or someone else is facing an imminent threat, and the officer is there to take that appropriate action. Right now, that being said, with all of the demonstrations that have resulted recently because of all this stuff, there's only one explanation for that, and that is demonic influence. I mean, there is lack of, if you notice, in these inner cities where all this is going on, not one, I mean, any other time there's something going on, you have pastors grouping together, going down and making their own marches down in the streets and trying to bring unity and, holding prayer rallies. None. There's zero evidence of this in any of these cities. Now, there may be a few pockets here and there that are meeting together, huddling together, but they're not going out in the streets and, being the intermediaries between, the opposing forces, if you want to call it. That's what it is, really, is opposing forces, good versus evil. But this can be explained by nothing else except demonic influence. And the only thing that can defeat demonic influence is prayer.
That's an interesting point. I want to get back to that. First, I want to say from your story of catching that individual and not shooting him, fortunately, because he got a cell phone, the most impressive thing is not that you didn't shoot to me, but the fact that you actually ran fast enough to catch this person, because I don't see you being that quick.
I attribute that to the adrenaline. That was a 100% pure adrenaline rush, I tell you. But see, I've always been a runner from the time in the military. I used to win my age group. I'd enter like 5K races and stuff like that, and I'd win. I have trophies up in the attic, of all that stuff. But I've always been a runner because of my military time, and I'd go down. When I went to drill sergeant school back in '86, I was weighing 180 pounds, and I was second place in the class in the diagnostic PT test when you got there. There's some little skinny dude that was a track star, was like 100 yards ahead of me, but I was ahead of everybody else. And I remember, because we ran a quarter-mile track, and you had to call out your number so they record it. And I remember about the 6th lap, as I was running by, I heard one of the instructors ask another, how does somebody that big run that fast? That's just the way I was. Even at the police academy, I wasn't there 45 years old, but I was like 6th or 7th in the class, even at that age. So they used to. I've had like 6-foot chases while I was on the streets before I became a supervisor, and I caught every one of them. And some of the officers used to rib the prisoner, when they're in there and I'm doing the paperwork. They say, how'd you let that old fat guy catch you anyway? You go, dude's faster than I thought.
That I wish I would have seen some of those on tape. Like, wow, this old white dude is fast, man.
Had one instance we were out on the highway, and the guy took off, jumped over a wall, and was trying to run down the exit ramp, and it was about a 8-foot drop, and the supervisor, when I called out, foot pursuit, on the radio, and he had pulled up the traffic cam, and he seen me. He said, dude, you covered that ground. There was probably 50 feet between the Jersey wall and the wall to the exit ramp, going across. And he said, and I looked at the video there. When I scaled the wall, I just put my hands down, threw the legs over, and I disappeared. Boom. I hit the ground running, and they could see me. I caught the guy in like 20 seconds. And he goes, I don't know how you do that.
That's one thing we had in common. I was never in law enforcement and never a first responder, but for a very, very brief time in my early 20s, I trained to be a firefighter. And on the physical thing, dude, I was always one of the fastest on that, half-mile run or whatever it was. and did all right with the other physical aspects of it. But I couldn't pass the test. I never was good at physics or chemistry, and you kind of need to know that in firefighting. So that coupled with the fact that I was never really good at following orders to begin with, I was like, yeah, I think I'll try another profession. Now a word from our sponsor, the Police Officers Credit Union Association. The POCUA can suggest a credit union that serves public safety professionals in practically every state in the country. One area we definitely have covered is Washington, D.C. Police Federal Credit Union serves the Metropolitan Police Department in the District of Columbia and several law enforcement agencies in Maryland and Virginia. For more information about Police Federal Credit Union, go to policefcu.com or call 877-278-7328. To find an institution to serve you outside of Washington, D.C., Maryland, or Virginia in any of the other 48 states, go to policecreditunions.com. And always remember, if you aren't banking with a POCUA credit union, you're just working with an institution that just so happens to serve public safety professionals, and you deserve better. Going back to what you said about demonic influence, I don't want to make this a religious show, coupled with I don't want it, to be a sequel to The Exorcist or anything like that. But one thing that you said that really popped into my mind is the fact that in all the news that I've watched, I've yet to see a pastor, a preacher, somebody of faith, rabbi, whatever, walking down a street with a bunch of people that are protesting the issue, but also protesting in a way that speaks to the preservation of life, speaks to principles and faith and so forth. And I didn't really think about that until just now. And I'll add one more thing. And one of the police foundation leaders, because I'm privileged to talk to a number of them around the country. I had a conversation, I want to say a week or two ago, and this particular professional who isn't a police officer, she's married to a police officer, she runs a police organization, mentioned that one of the places that they always found peace was in their church. And the church that they belong to has vilified not only police, but them so much that they've made them uncomfortable in their own church. And I thought to myself, all right, these are people of faith that should be finding, even if it's just minuscule, and I think that there's a lot more than just a shred that can bring us together. They should be looking for that in the spirit of faith. And that isn't happening. Why do you think that's the case? And is there a solution to all this in that?
Well, I'm not going to generalize all of the churches in the inner cities, as being under this, but, I'll just go back to Baltimore. That's where we're at, Baltimore, Maryland. And I think it's 2015 with Freddie Gray. Yeah. And the riots that took place. The pastors of those local churches down there held a rally, held a march, and they marched and they would come out and stand between the protesters and the police and try, hey, let's settle things down and all that. And that was covered on the news. They were out there, quote unquote, doing their job, right? But like I said, you're not seeing that in any of these cities, Seattle, Portland. Now they may be out there, but they're not being covered on the news like that, right? But I think part of the reason, I've talked about this on my radio show, that I believe part of the reason is it's such a hot button topic that these pastors, if they speak out against it, they're worried what would happen to their church, their building. So you're on their side now, so we can torch your building, type of thing. That's how volatile this situation is. That again, I don't want to generalize and put everybody under the same umbrella, but I have a feeling there are many pastors in the inner city that they feel they have to support their parishioners going out and doing these things. Otherwise, they're going to be vilified and, all the stuff that goes along with that. Instead of putting their faith in the Lord and saying, wrong is wrong and I'm going to speak out against it, they're just remaining silent.
Yeah.
And, because, and that sometimes being silent is just as bad as participating in the riots.
Yeah. In fact, on this show, and I've referred to her a number of times because she was a great guest as yourself. Her name is Melissa Agnes. She runs the Crisis Ready Institute, and is very, very against racism. She is believes that there's systematic racism in our country. And also is a huge proponent and supporter of law enforcement. So she comes at this problem from a few different perspectives, and one of the things that she said is that you can't fight emotion with logic.
That's right.
And I think that's what we try to do is we fight this issue with, well, you look at, whether it's the Jacob Blake case or the Breonna Taylor case, or the and I believe it's Rashad Jennings in Atlanta. And I apologize if I don't have that name right. There's so many cases that people are protesting about. It's literally hard for me to keep them all straight. And you look at those cases that people are protesting about, and if you look at all of the facts, you look at all of the logic. We'll talk about George Floyd later because that's a little bit more black and white. But you look at the facts of all the other cases that I mentioned, and you can easily look at the facts and say, you know what, law enforcement didn't exactly have it all wrong here. And just even to put that in a factual state is like, oh, well, you're obviously against us. You're obviously a racist because, I don't believe your facts. If we can't combat the emotion with logic, is it possible that we can combat the emotion with faith?
I understand your question.
Right.
The problem would come through, I think, when a lot of the people that are participating in the emotional aspect may be lacking faith. So therefore, they're just running on emotions. You have the people of faith who are caught in the middle. They see what's happening. They're angry with what's happening, but they're willing to go through the discussion aspect and talk about change and logical change, and, extra training for de-escalation techniques and things like that. But they're stuck living in the territory where the lack of faith is prevailing right now. And the only thing they're running on is emotion. So they're kind of stuck in the middle, and the police are like, hey, we can talk about it. The people of emotion, we're not talking about anything anymore. We're just going to burn it down. And then the people of faith who are living in that area, I think they're stuck. They want to have the discussion, but at the same time, they can't say they want to have the discussion because they're living in the territory that's under nightly riots.
Yeah.
And so I think that's the problem there.
Yeah. It's a interesting point.
And if I can interject
Please.
this, if the leadership of these cities would stand up and do their job, that would go a long way to promoting the efforts of logic and discussion. But instead, they tell the police just back off. The old mayor of Baltimore City said, let them burn the city because we can rebuild. Just let them have it. And told the police to stand down. But if these 100 plus nights of riots and terrorism and things like that, and you handcuff the cops, basically, you tell them just leave them alone, let them go.
Yeah, that was the case here in Long Beach, California, in late May, early June. That was the case. in Indianapolis. That was, I could go on and on and on. I've seen that happen. Seattle, Portland, and I keep thinking about uh, Giuliani's book on in theory on the broken glass theory, that you don't let things escalate to that point.
Yep.
Because then you got a real problem on your hands. But that's probably a different show. Maybe I'll get Giuliani on here. From a police officer's standpoint, and I eventually want to get to some possible solutions, because it seems like we're a void of solutions, other than just bluntly defunding police or blindly defending police. And I don't think either extreme is going to work. We need to find something in the middle. But it seems like the George Floyd case, which was obviously wrong. Every law enforcement professional I've talked to, either active or retired, has said that what happened with George Floyd was completely wrong.
Yep.
Now sometimes what's interesting is we kind of argue, not really argue, but discuss and have different opinions as to at what point did it go wrong. Some say it's somewhere by the car. Some say it was somewhere in that 8.5 minutes, so that there's some discussion on that. But I have yet to find anybody in law enforcement to say that, what he did was completely right, which is not the case.
And
but
he'll pay for that too.
Yeah.
He's going to be prosecuted.
Yeah, he will, and he'll pay for it.
Yep.
But is it possible that the George Floyd case, being one where anybody that is part of Black Lives Matter holds that up and said, here, see what's happening, and now they're using some of these other cases which aren't as clear cut as George Floyd as the excuse for the protests and so forth? Can that be the case? And is there something from a faith or logic standpoint that we could do with that type of knowledge?
Well, the continuing cases where this is happening can be attributed back to what we were talking about: lack of compliance on the part of the suspect.
Yeah.
And if the suspect doesn't run, the cops don't have to chase them. If they don't have to chase them, they don't have to tackle them and get into a scruffle with them. And that's where things go south fairly quick. So number one is the attitude on the street has to change back to one of law and order again. The cops, they don't want to, I don't know of any cops that gets up in the morning and says, I feel like shooting somebody today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not going to happen. They don't want to do that. And, they would rather just have a nice, easy shift, go home at the end of the day, did my job,
Yeah.
But they are there to handle whatever situation arises. So it comes back again to the leadership of the community not doing their job, and especially the men and women of faith not fulfilling their obligation of praying for the city and actually going out, get outside of the four walls and go down and become that buffer between the antagonists and the police, between the one faction on one side and one faction on the other side. The people of faith have to go into the midst of the turmoil and use their faith to bring about peace. But you're not seeing that right now anywhere. And, part of the outrage is all about, well, since the George Floyd thing, we've had 7 other, shootings of unarmed black men, this is terrible, blah, blah, blah. How many unarmed black men were killed by other black men?
Yeah.
In the inner city, just here in Baltimore over the weekend, they had, I think they said 12 shootings and 6 deaths, something like 13 shootings and 6 deaths, something like that. And that's just one city. But yet no protests, no outrage, and Chicago, good Lord. Chicago's lost more people in the past what, 3 or 4 years than the entire Afghanistan war soldiers lost, you know,
Yeah.
over 20, but no outrage, you know, no protest about that. You know,
Yeah.
it's always that one police officer, you know.
Yeah, yeah, I hear you, Robert. So to kind of wrap this up a little bit, looking at solutions, um, one, is the solution, just possibly mayors, police chiefs, and faith leaders getting together on TV, going out there and showing a united front and saying, this is the beginning of something else. Is that the solution to begin to bridge a gap with everybody that is so angry, or is it something else?
No, I believe that would be a good first step, because you have the legal authorities, which is the mayors, the city councilmen, and all that. They're the governmental authorities in that area, right? The police chief and his, chief assistants, that represents the department, the law enforcement branch that is the point of all the turmoil. And then you have the men and women of faith, the church leaders, ministry leaders, synagogue leaders coming to meet with them that can help begin the discussion. And of course, you'd have to have representatives from the leaders of the protest groups and all that involved as well, so that they can go back and say, okay, let's quiet things down. They're working on, and begin the process. That's what's lacking right now, is a process of moving forward. Right now, the only process that we see is a process of destruction. That's it, and the city leaders refuse to talk bad about it until it comes outside their house. They say, oh, this, you can't, I'm on your side. Why are you at my house? Type thing. Yeah. But, the heck with everybody for the last 100 days that was suffering through it. But I think if the men and women of faith, the pastors, leaders, ministry leaders, would make the effort to be the intermediaries and begin the process of discussion with the city leadership, with the police leadership, with the protest leadership, it would go a long ways towards beginning the path of resolution. Right now, there is no path.
Yeah. Well, and even on the law enforcement side, even though this is a first responder and pro law enforcement show, as I tell many people, law enforcement has some responsibilities here too, to change and use this as an opportunity to, as I like to say, let's forget about defunding and defending. Let's find a way to develop the police, because we could talk about issues and lack of change and so forth in that sector too. Is there an other than just doing surface level, okay, we're not going to do chokeholds anymore, everybody should be okay, there's no more chokeholds? Well, that's ridiculous. What can law enforcement do to help to progress the change, real change, to be able to bridge the gaps with communities and with the protesters, in your mind?
Well, let me just cover real quick about defunding, removing some of the funds from the police department. Right now, the police departments are strapped and they're short-staffed, which means overtime for existing officers. The academy, they're required to have so many hours of whatever training, and they're trying their best to get the recruits to go out on the street and relieve some of the pressure, so they're not paying all this overtime. By adding more classes to the academy, you're extending that out. So now you got instructors that have to be paid, because a lot of them are college instructors, are coming from the community colleges in to teach. You're extending that out, which means you're also paying the recruits those extra couple of weeks, a month that they're in the academy. You're paying the instructors for that extra time. You're paying the overtime on the street for the other officers who are covering for them. So defunding them is going to do a couple of things, and that is cutting the budget. They got to take officers off the street, cut the number of recruits in the class. There has to be a cut somewhere in there, and that impacts what's going to happen on the street. I believe that they should have some resolution training and de-escalation techniques and things like that. included in the academy class, other than the 1 or 2 days that are devoted to it now. But at the same time we're going down that path, there has to be an effort made to, I hate saying educate, but make people aware that if you are in a confrontation with a police officer and they say stop, that doesn't mean screw you, I'm still running. You know?
Especially if Thibodeau's chasing you, he'll probably catch you.
That's right.
Yeah. Yeah, I hear you completely on the defunding issue. When somebody says defund the police, I usually just simply ask, all right, well, what's your plan? You know, what's the plan? What are the alternatives? You know, you can't just.
And let's look at from the prospect of the inner cities right now, where all this turmoil is going on. They say, well, we need more officers on the street. Okay, how are you going to draw these officers into the academy from those neighborhoods? Because the potential people are like, man, I don't want to be a cop right now. Yeah. That's why so many cops are putting in their retirement papers and all. It's like, you know, that's the attitude. I'm done. I've got my 23 years in, or what. I'm out of here. So the young officers who have 2-3 years on the force are suddenly finding themselves as supervisors, because their supervisors got promoted to fill a gap, and those supervisors got promoted to, you know, senior leadership, but they don't have the, you know, several years of experience at that level. So now you got inexperienced supervisors teaching inexperienced officers what they need to do. And to draw in more people, they have to lower the standards at the academy. So now you're taking people who normally you wouldn't even consider letting them be a police officer. Now, like, well, okay, come on in, you know. And, you know, people are hot-headed or whatever the case may be, right? Yeah. So now that's exasperating the people on the street interacting with, you know, stuff going on. So that defunding thing, that is just, you know, Russian roulette. That's all it is.
Yeah, you got a vicious cycle there where you already have inexperienced officers that are stressed on so many levels, are on edge, and now we're creating an even more potentially volatile situation, which I think, you know, possibly played a part in Kenosha, at least in my opinion, in looking at it. But yeah, I could talk to you all afternoon on this, Robert. And I certainly reserve the right to bring you back, but I really appreciate your perspective. I appreciate your service, both as a man of faith and as a retired police officer.
I appreciate that.
The last question that I have for you is, anybody in our audience that either wants to find Evangelism Radio, any of the other podcasts and shows that you do, or tap into any of your expertise as we talked about today, how best can they find you?
I guess the most popular platform is evangelismradio.com. It's an online Christian radio station, been rated #1 in the world on many occasions in the Christian talk niche. They also go over to the podcast, KCR Podcast, Kingdom Crossroads Podcast. It's kcrpodcast.com. And there's contact forms there. They can reach out and come straight to me.
Perfect. Thank you again, Robert, for being a great guest and being willing to talk about something that isn't an easy subject to talk about. I really appreciate your time.
Not a problem, man. I appreciate the opportunity.
My pleasure. And thank you to all of you that have either watched or listened to this episode of Public Safety Talk Radio. And we'll be with you again next week with another great guest. Take care. Public Safety Talk Radio is produced by the POCUA. POCUA is a consortium of financial institutions serving law enforcement as well as other first responders and public safety professionals. To learn more about our association and to find one of our credit unions or service providers near you, go to www.policecreditunions.com. And always remember, if you aren't working with one of our POCUA credit unions, you're just banking with an institution that just so happens to serve first responders. As a public safety professional, you and your family deserve better. Find a POCUA credit union today.